All right, good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Disorder Group for giving us feedback on their discussions this semester. I found the idea of a disorder reading group really provocative and was delighted to be a speaker coming out of that set of discussions that they had. Okay, there we go. So I believe that I was invited to speak to you because my work is quite interested in the concept of disorder. And there are any number of ways you could approach disorder. You could think about it scientifically in terms of entropy. You could think about it politically in terms of anarchy. You could think about it aesthetically in terms of expression, certain forms of expression. As you just heard, we could think about it in terms of a psychological set of disorders that apparently predisposes you to rule large countries. But tonight, I'm going to lay out for you the meaning of disorder in relationship to the topic of a book I'm writing on wildness. And the category of wildness becomes interesting to us in what we're calling now the Anthropocene, in a moment of incredible environmental crisis, but also at a time when democracy is failing us and when people are turning to thinking about disruption, disorder, disobedience, all kinds of activities that should create more wildness on behalf of the alternative political imaginaries that I think we're invested in. So what I'm going to do today is present some pieces from this book that's in progress, a sort of sprawling book that I'm calling, here I'm going to talk about bewilderment in particular, but the book is called Wild Things, Queerness After Nature. And if you think about nature, nature was the thing against which queerness, queer people, LGBT people were defined at the end of the 19th century. But now that we're after nature, we no longer have nature, we don't really believe in nature, we've destroyed nature. What then comes of those kinds of categories that have been opposed to nature? So that's one way of thinking about this. But the three topics that I'll address in the first part of the talk, I actually want to lay out a bit of a theoretical framework. It's not too long, but thinking with Foucault and others, Thoreau, for example, I want to give you the parameters of something that I'm calling wildness. In the second half, the second piece of the talk, I'll try to address this question of disorder by thinking about who it is that gets classified as wild under the heading of civilization. Right? So wildness only has meaning for us because it was produced as the negative to civilization under colonialism. So who is it that we mean when we say that certain groups of people are wild? And I'll think about that very specifically. And then in the last part of the talk, to take us out of this colonial structure, I'm going to present the work of the artist who's on the beautiful little flyer that you got for this talk, Kent Monkman, who is a Canadian native artist who paints scenes of what I'm calling decolonial bewilderment. Okay, so it's sort of those people who have been classified as wild, in this case, queer indigenous people, rethink their relationship to wildness, order and disorder, civilization and its discontents through these incredible, massive, allegorical paintings in which the Indian strikes back. Okay, so that's where we're going. I have lots of images to guide us along our way. You will know, at least in an American context, the person who is most credited with theories of wildness and the wild is Henry David Thoreau, who is also often credited with early forms of anarchism. He wrote about civil disobedience. He suggested that when the state is corrupt, the duty of the citizens is towards disobedience and, the refusal of patriotism, right? So Henry David Thoreau, after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, suggested that it was no longer on him to serve the government or to be loyal to the government because the government had proved itself to be so completely and utterly corrupt. So he's an interesting thinker to think with. But what's great in the last few years is that people have turned to his work on nature rather than his writings on the political for a theory of wildness. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go. But of course, no talk on wildness would be complete without a quote from Madagascar, maybe something closer to home for some of us, in which the conceit is that these animals in the Bronx Zoo in New York get a chance to break out and go wild, and they're sort of horrified by this prospect. So Alex the lion says, "The wild, are you nuts? That's the worst idea I've ever heard." Melman the giraffe, "It's unsanitary." Marty the zebra, "The penguins are going. Why can't I?" Alex the lion, "The penguins are psychotic." Okay, so there are lots of examples in both popular culture and canonical culture where we have made presumptions about what constitutes wildness. So this is a text I'm going to reference a lot. Hopefully some people recognize it here, Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, which is a beloved children's book, at least in the US. I don't remember reading it in the UK when I grew up here. Did people read it here? Yeah, it's pretty universal. After he died, after Sendak died, and really towards the end of his life, he came out as a gay man and wrote about his relationship to Where the Wild Things Are in terms of his Holocaust survivor relatives. So it's a really super interesting text to think with as well. Okay, so as I said, 3 sections. The first one is a little bit theoretical, so just bear with me because I don't think it's possible to talk about wildness in just completely general terms. I want to be a little more clear about what I mean by wildness. And hopefully you all recognize this quotation, somebody who guides our thinking about all kinds of things, Adele, who sang, "I've forgotten how it felt before the world fell at our feet," which is a sort of colonial statement, if ever there was one. So, okay. Let me see if I can lay out for you some understanding of what we mean by the wild. Wildness, says Hayden White, he's a sort of intellectual historian, if you like, he says that wildness belongs to what he calls a class of self-authenticating devices, like heresy and madness, which don't describe a state of being so much as describe its antithesis. Do you see? So in order to know what... in order to set up the parameters of something like civilization, because it would be impossible to say everything that civilization is, we come up with a category like wildness for what is not civilization. And we do that a lot. The category of homosexuality was well rounded out by scientists long before there was any conception whatsoever of heterosexuality. So we had a word for homosexuality in 1869. The word heterosexuality did not enter into common usage until 1910. So there is, as Hayden White suggests, a whole class of these categories, the negative category. So queer would be another one of these categories, by which we come to know the positive piece of the equation. And he suggests that wildness lends value to the term of civilization by defining, without really having to specify, a negative terrain and a value, a state, quote, hostile to normal humanity. So this sort of picks up a little bit on this malignant normality that Jordan was telling us about. So this guy, Hayden White, is really writing about the function of wildness in the very early colonial period. So my question when I started this work was, well, what would be the meaning of wildness now then? Is it still just a negative towards which we can, aspire within a positive realm? Do we want to just see wildness as everything that did not fall under the sway of civilization? Is it just animal life? Is it untamed vegetation? Is it someone who's a little crazy? If it is all of those things, then those are pretty interesting states of being that I think we should want to know more about. And we should want to know more about them in relationship to each other, right? So what if all of those things were under one heading? Wild vegetation, wild animals, crazy people, the intensity of the weather, wild weather, right? This is an interesting set of expressions. Modernism used the category of wildness under the heading of primitivism. So this is not, the investigation of wildness began very clearly in art, at least in the modern period, and was basically part of a colonial system within which desire and fear was projected onto a pre-civilized past. And that's what you see in these kinds of paintings, is both a desire to go back to a time when the world was wild, but a deep-seated fear of those kinds of subjects who might represent the wild, right? So there were art movements like fauvism, for example, and the word fauvism came from the French for wild beasts, and you saw a kind of preoccupation with the artist to capture the turmoil, both of modern life, but also some sort of freedom associated with wildness from the past. So those kinds of movements, and this has been investigated thoroughly in art history, these primitivist movements associated wildness very strongly with racialized others. And this is part of the problem of using the category of wildness, is that wildness was projected in very early on in the 20th century, not onto white people at all, but onto people of color, onto colonial subjects, onto areas of the world that were seen as, pre-modern, and so on. So wildness, you could say, has functioned disastrously as part of a spatial sense of national belonging that supposedly has been spoiled in the post-colonial period by unchecked immigration and the collapse of a rigidly maintained class system. So we represent wildness now as a Muslim threat, this creeping intensity of this wild other religion that doesn't think the way we do, that somehow has within it a fury that supposedly we don't find in Christianity, right? As if Christianity hasn't been responsible for massive forms of violence and all kinds of realms of ideas that are bigoted and racist and so on. So we're often using this category of wildness to pathologize otherness and to then produce the justification for more forms of order, right? So if you represent the Islamic world as wild, and that's what terrorism is, it's unpredictable, it works through surprise and so on. If Islam is wild, then the antidote is more order, right? So this is why we might be kind of interested in disorder rather than order. Okay, so how can you use a term like wildness then if it's doing all of this work, the work of othering and pathologization? So I would say that while we're very familiar with these colonial understandings of the wild, savage otherness, immaturity, apocalypse, and so on, they have not exhausted what we mean by wildness. Wildness still holds within it a whole cluster of concepts that I think we're pretty interested in nowadays, hence the disorder group, hence interesting conversations that people might be having about disobedience, all kinds of language around, say, ungovernability, as we'll see in a moment when I start talking about anarchy. In academia, people have become interested recently in something that's called new materialism. And new materialism suggests that humans are not the only living, signifying entities on Earth. And so people like Jane Bennett have she wrote a book called Vibrant Matter, in which she suggested that humans assign only to themselves the power of living, the power of transformation, when in fact transformative power is all around us. So she writes, she has a whole book on wildness, Jane Bennett does, that's about Thoreau. Thoreau said, "It does seem as if mine were a particularly wild nature which so yearns towards all wildness." And for anyone who knows about Thoreau, he basically took himself off into the woods, and he, in that Jane Bennett way, he communed with woodchucks and frogs and trees, and he believed that there were multiple other orders of life inscribed into the wild from which we could learn. And so he took elaborate notes, he cut off from humankind, he decided that humans were too interested in business and in money and in governing, and he wanted to find a different kind of life, living with these other life forms in the woods. There's a great book, if you wanted to think more about this, an anthropologist went to Ecuador and studied, mostly anthropologists go and study people. He went and studied the forest in Ecuador. So he wrote a book, what was it called? How Forests Think, Beyond an Anthropology of the Human. And he suggested that when you go into these forests in Ecuador, you are now witness to multiple signifying systems with trees and vegetation and monkeys and birds all talking to each other. That chatter in the forest that we think just sounds like nothing, it sounds like noise, is only noise to us. To other creatures, there's all kinds of information being given back and forth. And it goes on sort of almost without human intervention. So this is literally a study of the forest as an entity. That's the kind of work that I'm talking about under the heading of wildness. And there's lots of other work on this. For Thoreau, we learn from Jane Bennett, the wild, and that was that first quote that I gave you, the wild sort of nestles up to the good, not as a moral investment in the natural, but Bennett suggests as a longing for something extraordinary and unencompassable. And that's what Thoreau says. He says, human life is all too predictable and boring. If you really want to be surprised, if you want to live in wonder, you have to go into the woods. And so he has these fantastic passages where he says things like, he wants to study something like moonlight. And he says, a little village looks completely normal by day, but at night, lit up by moonlight, something really strange happens, at which point the village becomes wild. So he's attuned to the micro realities of life on Earth, not simply mediated by human endeavor. And it's there that he believes that there's this sort of humming variation all around us that increasingly in urban areas we ignore and we just fail to notice, that we have nothing to do with. And therefore we lose completely our connection to the wild. So that one way that you could go then from Thoreau would be to someone like Nietzsche and suggest that wildness ends at that moment when we no longer believe in God. But there are also echoes of what Bennett's talking about in Foucault's The Order of Things, and that's where I go in my project. So The Order of Things, for those of you who haven't read it, is one of these amazing Foucauldian books in which he sort of describes, as his want, how we came to think about the world the way that we did. And he pays attention to the massive classifying systems of the 17th and 18th century that took what they considered to be a wild world and affixed names and systems to that world. Think of someone like Linnaeus. Foucault makes a really different argument in The Order of Things about this realm of human inscription. He says, he is also, like Nietzsche, talking about what happens when you move from thinking about the world as organized by God to thinking about a world that is somehow organized according to some natural plan under the heading of Darwin, say. So he says, transferring its most secret essence from the vegetable to the animal kingdom, life has left the tabulated space of order and become wild once more. The same movement that dooms it to death reveals it as murderous. It kills because it lives. Nature can no longer be good. So this could be, in a way, the epigraph for my study. Nature can no longer be good. Under God, if you believe in God, nature is good, because nature is God's plan. And nature basically ascribes meaning to everything. So if you take God out of the picture, Foucault says, nature can no longer be good. Nature has other kinds of purposes. And he also says here, life has left the tabulated space of order, right? There's no more great chain of being reaching down from God to the animals, and it becomes wild once more. So counterintuitively, he ascribes to the modern period a becoming wild again. The space where God is withdrawn is a wild space. The same movement that dooms us to death, he's saying, also reveals us as murderous. So a life that could be justified in being taken by saying it was God's will, if you take away God's will, now you're murderous, right? So this means, therefore, that the human is no longer ascribed this moral plan of, it's good if God wanted it, it's bad if God didn't. Now we are responsible for this moral order, and that's where the wildness comes in. So I argue, therefore, that Foucault is interested in an experience of what some philosophers have called finitude, right? Where you're not going to go on to a better life in heaven. You are consigned to confronting finitude, the fact of an ending. And he calls this experience of life an untamed ontology. So you can see this language of wildness is all through Foucault and is part of what I would call the disorder of things. Okay, so if there's an order of things in modernity, there must also be a disorder of things that we should busy ourselves in investigating. This is how Foucault writes about it, and this is where the Adele comes in. He says, on the other side of all the things that are, he says that there's this wild ontology, this untamed ontology lies on the other side of all the things that are, and even beyond those that can be. Okay, so hello from the other side is this other side to the modern. Yes, the modern is a place of order, but it's also a place where life becomes wild once more. So we're living then in a time where wildness means something very different than it did in the colonial period. And here we might think about Deleuze, who talks about a world of wild production and explosive desire. Desire that is constantly being produced. You could also think here of the work of Paul Preciado, who describes a kind of life cycle of addiction, where we're organisms that are constantly being revved up by excitement and then brought down by frustration. And Preciado describes this as a kind of drug cycle of amusement, pleasure, and pain that the human subject is submitted to through a very elaborate pharmacological regime. So Preciado writes about the fact that we're all of us taking drugs constantly. And you might say, well, I don't take anything, but you might have a cup of tea, or you might have coffee, or you might have sugar. We are constantly, or you might watch television and get all jacked up watching television. Whatever it is, we are subject to these cycles of excitation, frustration that are part of what Deleuze calls the wild production of desire, explosive desire. Other people have considered what sexuality is in the modern period, and while we have a completely conventional narrative down pat now about sexuality as something that was produced at the end of the 19th century and produced the terminology of homo and hetero, trans and cis, gendered bodies, etc., some people like Pete Coviello, for example, have looked for different vocabularies away from the medical terminology that we've used and within aesthetic realms. And he suggests that particularly from about the 1890s to the 1920s, while that medical classification was ongoing, lots of people escaped the net of medical classification and used completely other systems and methods to signify their desire. And so he talks about desire under the headings of things like extravagance. And if you think about, like, what would it mean if we had a system of sexuality that thought in terms of extravagance rather than hetero, or homo. Extravagance, like more than. Extravagant desire is a desire that is beyond the needs of reproduction and survival, right? So here there's a nice connotation there of the excessive or the unyarded. The way in which we're all of us sort of, locked in, boxed in into terrains, into ways of being, into categories, into identities. What if we were unyarded? What if we understood sexuality in relationship to being bound or being unyarded, being errant, wandering, right? This terminology to me, which is a terminology of wildness, is much more interesting to think with about the experience of being in a body. So I'm arguing, if you like, that wildness can give us a much more interesting, much more inventive vocabulary for who we are as desiring subjects. Okay, so let me just conclude this section then by saying that the point here is not, simply to reject the medical or to provide periodization for when the world changed, that kind of thing. The point here is to find a vocabulary, a narrative, new forms of figuration for what I'm calling this inevitable disorder of things that we are living within. for identity forms that fail to resolve, and for all kinds of unruly lives. And we often assign, unruliness to people who we're seeking to reject, like homeless people or people who live alone. But we are all subject to that unruliness that Foucault calls the other side of all the things that are. Now, my argument here is not that we should go wild, that we should all find a way to go wild. I mean, I'm not arguing against that, but I'm not arguing for it. That we have to leave to, primitivists and Madagascar's psychotic penguins, remember, who wanted to go wild. What we're looking for instead is what we've ignored by simply assigning certain forms that we want to reject to wildness. What else resides within the wild? What might we want to retrieve from the wild right now? Okay, so there you go. That's the theory of it. Take it or leave it. It's a sort of a way of grounding the project, if you like, in some other forms of thinking that are ongoing. So the next two sections are a bit more example-oriented. Where the wild things are, I want to start thinking then about the forms of embodiment and personhood that get rejected from the category of the domesticated and pushed into the category of the wild. So if you think about it, what comes to mind immediately, for me anyway, when I began the project is, for example, the child, right? The wild child, the animal, and then very obviously the pre-civilized other, or the native. And we literally talk about wild Indians. So there are certain forms of racialization, there are certain stages of life, and there are certain non-human entities that we have definitively associated with wildness. Most of those themes come to bear in this children's book that we know and love, but that is, as opaque, as difficult, as curious, if you like, as any theoretical text that you might read. I mean, you can pore over this book for years and not really understand what it is about, okay? So let me just make my stab at it, just to remind you. In Where the Wild Things Are, we basically have a story of a journey. It's set at its inception in the domestic household that is defined by the mother. And Max and his mother have a fight, and she sends him to his room, and he's just like, and she threatens to eat him up. This is a very cannibalistic scene of encounter between mother and child. And he says, screw you, I'm out of here. And he goes off on a long voyage and arrives where the wild things are, okay? Now, what's super interesting here is that where the wild things are is not the wild, okay? So that's the first point that I want to make. The book doesn't say, it's not called The Wild, it's called Where the Wild Things Are, okay? So this speaks exactly to that colonial division that I just set up, in which there is a space that is domesticated, civilized, normal, and real, and then there is another space. And that other space is where wild things are, okay? So off goes Max, and he finds this place of ruination, really. And remember I said that Sendak based this story on images of his relatives, some of whom were Holocaust survivors, and who were really scary to him. And that was the basis for a lot of these drawings that he did. So we really shouldn't be comforted by this story at all. He goes to this place of ruination. He finds ruined people who are wild things. And because they're so ruined, they let him be king. And he realizes that being king of the wild things is no better than being the subject to the very orderly, domesticated queen, right? And he decides that this isn't the space he wants either, and he goes home again. So the child's return prefigures, in a way, his own ruination. He can see what his future is, and he can see no way out of it. So wildness is going to be then, in that story, is not the place where the wild things are, but it's also not the domestic home that Max goes back to. It's some other place, a kind of utopian place that we have to, that the story gestures towards, but doesn't take us to. So I would say that a lot of artists over the past 100 years or so have tried to figure out what is this other place that is not the domestic, but is also not the place where you place the ruined. What does it look like? Where is it? And what does it have to do with various political orders? It might be that the space that we're looking for is has something to do with what we have called anarchy. So let me think through anarchy with you for a moment. It's noticeable to me that a lot of the Occupy movements and some of the other movements that have been attempting to disrupt this horrendous status quo that we're in have returned to anarchy. And I don't think it's the anarchy that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. It's not Proudhon, it's not Rosa Luxemburg. It's not early 20th century anarchy. It's a different kind of anarchy. Why would I say that? Because anarchists at the beginning of the 20th century could not have predicted the form that the state would take. So their anarchy is not, it cannot possibly direct us in thinking through the form of the state that we have now inherited. The state is different. We've gone through the 20th century. We've seen the effects of totalitarianism. And we've seen in neoliberal contexts what happens when the state and the market collude on behalf of the very wealthy in the ruination of everybody else. So I would argue that this is exactly the moment to think about anarchy. On that tip, just to give you an example of this and how it links to indigeneity, in the 1990s, indigenous groups in Ecuador fought vigorously against a series of elected governments, and they were trying to protect the land that these indigenous groups were based on from the government who was trying to sell that land to foreign oil interests. So 5 governments were brought down in the 1990s in Ecuador, and the governments blamed the indigenous land-based movements. And at one point, one of the presidents who was brought down said, this is untenable. These people are ungovernable. Well, the indigenous groups of Ecuador responded by saying, we seek to be ungovernable. That is our political project, is to be ungovernable. And you see that when a people becomes ungovernable, you can bring the state down. And that's exactly what happened, at which point the Ecuador government had to make a deal, and they created a platform called Buen Vivir, the good life, which gave rights to nature, rights to queer people, and rights to indigenous people. And the right that nature had was not to be exploited by oil drilling. All of that has not lasted, and very, very recently, the Chinese and other investors have bought that very land that the indigenous Yasuni people were protecting. So on the one hand, it's a sort of bad news story, but on the other hand, if you want to say, well, anarchy, what would that look like? Well, I just gave you an example of indigenous-based anarchy in which people sought to become ungovernable and did, in the process, bring down a totally corrupt regime. And I think we can go, as long as we get out of the US and Europe, we can find really interesting examples, particularly in Latin America, where the tradition of anarchy is really different, really interesting examples of disorderly conduct that has the kind of effect that we might be looking for. Oh, okay. So before we get to bewilderment, which will be my last section, let me just say that lots of indigenous scholars have actually theorized wildness in various ways. And probably the person that you should know about is Jody Byrd, who wrote a book called The Transit of Empire, in which she uses post-colonial theory to think about the relationship to futurity of indigenous peoples. So she explains how within what she calls zombie imperialism, native people are basically, in order to avoid saying that native people were subject to a genocidal mission on the part of Europeans and Americans, she suggests that theories were produced in the 19th century to say that native peoples evolved out of existence. So that's the zombie imperialism. The imperialist never says, we got rid of those native people. They say, oh, disease happened. Primitive people were not able to keep up with the demands of modernity. And so eventually those communities faded away, when what they actually did was force people into reservations, force them to give up their land, possess, seized land that native people never considered to be theirs in the first place, and set up land rights and legal restrictions that made it impossible for indigenous people to then make a claim on that land again. And this happened very effectively in Australia, such that indigenous people have had a very hard time claiming land back, and it happened for sure in the US. So under those conditions, Jody Byrd asked the question, what is wildness to a Native American person or to a native person? If the native person is wild to modernity, what is wild for the native person? And she suggests that native people have had to live under what she calls the cacophonies of colonialism, in which they confront this incredible violence that comes in the form of a civilizing mission, as Christianity, in the form of disease, and in the form of a possessive snatching of land. Colonialism for Jody Byrd then is a violent system of cultures and people that, quote, creates shockwaves that ripple outward from the collision in time, space, and popular culture. But she also suggests that there's such a thing as indigenous critical theory, in which native theorists have produced other kinds of concepts. And one concept that she offers up as an opposition to colonialism and civilization is cacophony. So she says colonialism creates a cacophony, but native people have their own form of cacophony, which she uses as a metaphor for anarchy. Why anarchy? Because native people don't think that they are subject to the state, because the state stole their land, and therefore they set themselves up as not ruled by the state, but as governed by other kinds of interests. So while the colonial narrative wants to smooth out all of this dissonance in the encounter with native others, the native critical theorist wants to intensify the anarchy and the cacophony in order to oppose colonialism and create a new space of wildness. And it's that space that I'm going to turn to finally in this last section on bewilderment. Okay, so do you see what I'm saying? So if civilization has produced wildness as a byproduct, assigned native people to it, suggested that's a realm of anarchists, that's children, they grow out of it. We want to figure out what kinds of politics emerge out of those wild places that have been rejected by colonial orders. On behalf of that, I want to think with you and with the work of Kent Monkman about the category of bewilderment, which, if you even just think about that word, holds within it an anti-enlightenment notion of not knowing, right? So civilization, colonialism, enlightenment is all about knowing, mastering, possessing, inscribing, ordering, ruling, extracting, right? And it's conversant and completely compatible with capitalism, and it has resulted in the exact configuration of economy and exploitation that we live with now. So what are going to be our tools, our disorderly tools, to fight this? And one answer might be bewilderment, which we were talking about today over at the Chelsea College of Art. Okay, so let me explain what bewilderment is. And there's this great book on early modern emotions by Susan Broomhall that suggests that emotions have a history. And we tend, just the same way that we think about sexuality as always having been around in the same form that we experience it, she suggests, and we now know that that is absolutely not true. Sexuality means completely different things to ancient Greeks than it does to us. She suggests that modern emotions are not the same as what those emotional states might have meant some 300 or 400 years ago. And she just gives us some words that express states of being that meant something really different in the early modern period. So words that we use as synonyms now once delineated completely different realms of not just emotion, but practice or activity. So we just say, oh yeah, I'm amazed by that. But amazement was literally being lost in a maze. So this idea that we have amazement is like, wow, I can't believe that. That's not what it meant in the early modern period. It meant that you couldn't find your way through something and you became amazed, right? Embedded in a system out of which you could not find your way. Astonishment, and you can even see the word stone is in there. Astonishment, right? Meant being knocked out by a stone, which maybe, I mean, it sounds like a Monty Python skit, honestly, but maybe that happened a lot, in the early modern period, so they needed a word for it. Oh yeah, he was astonished. He got knocked out by a stone. We've lost that archaic usage of the word. We use it instead very abstractly and metaphorically to just say, wow, I'm astonished. It's like as if I've been knocked out by a stone, but there are no stones being thrown at me. Similarly, bewilder is one of these words. Bewilderment is one of these words. Bewilder meant we use it metaphorically. We've lost the sense of something. It was in that, in the 16th, and 16th, 17th, 18th century, it was what happened when you got lost in a wild place. And that, right there inscribes the distance that we have from earlier relationships to wildness. We don't have many wild spaces to get lost in anymore. Everyone's on their phones, you've got your GPS, you're connected by satellite. Even wilderness spaces, you're going to come across eventually probably a sign that will tell you how many miles it is to the next, marker, whatever. We have completely inscribed the world so that there's no possibility of losing one's path. So Samuel Johnson described bewilderment as to lose in pathless places or to confound for want of a plain road. So I love this idea of bewilderment, and I think you can trace an entire history of wildness in the history of that word. I want to take the word bewilderment and suggest that it isn't just a synonym then and an abstract formulation for a state of disorientation. Bewilderment I'll offer to you as one of these new critical vocabularies that I'm interested in that moves in an opposite direction to colonial knowing, right? And remember that anthropology was one of these arms of colonialism that anthropologists were sent out into the world to get to know the natives so that they could be ruled better, which is why I loved that book about the anthropology beyond the human. What if the counter discourse is one of bewilderment in the face of all kinds of things that we see happening in the world around us? From a decolonial perspective, we could think with an anti-enlightenment intent about rethinking this mapping orientation that we have to the world and thinking instead in terms of bewilderment. Now, you'll remember Jody Byrd, who wrote about cacophony. One of the ways in which she distinguishes between systems of knowing that are colonial and systems of knowing that are indigenous are along horizontal versus vertical axes. And she suggests that colonial knowing is always vertical. We know, we'll tell you, you'll implement, right? She suggests that in indigenous societies and in anti-colonial movements, there's an emphasis on horizontality. That is one of the main principles, I think, of Kent Monkman's work. And just to give you this one painting that I'll analyze in a moment, you can see that it is very, very much horizontal. This is not a great chain of being. This is a horizontal plane within which many, many different things are happening. So I'm winding down here towards a conclusion by thinking about the opposition that Monkman's work proposes to colonial forms of knowing and being through the lens of wildness and potentially bewilderment. So let me tell you about Kent Monkman. Do people know Kent Monkman at all? How many people? No, not many. Okay. He's a Canadian artist. As you can see, he works in oil on massive canvases, and only in the last 10 years or so has become a very, very big deal, to the point where his canvases actually do sell for quite a lot of money. But when I was in Toronto just a few months ago, he was having an open studio. He lives in Toronto. He's a Cree / Irish artist, so he's from First Nations people, the Cree people. And he was having an open studio. It was kind of amazing because these are really, really huge canvases, and they do sell now for a massive amount of money. But in his open studio, you'd have canvases like that, just sitting on an open easel, And there were hundreds of people in this room jostling to get a look right up against this painting. Anyone could have touched it, nudged it, knocked it. You know, there was none of that kind of preciousness of like, watch out for the canvases. He just was standing somewhere, drink in hand, hoping everyone had a good time. At the front of the room, there was an area he had set up, a tableau, in which anyone could enter into the scene that he'd set up as it would look like a saloon from an old cowboy film. And you could enter in, sit on a couch with a gorgeously made up drag queen, indigenous drag queen, and have your photograph taken. So it was like an incredible scene of cacophony and horizontality, even in his studio. A lot of his paintings are about rethinking the scene of encounter between colonial interests in Canada and the native peoples who live there. He completely rewrites them in the language of revolt and disorder. So this one is called, as you can see, Seeing Red. It first appeared in the year that Canada was celebrating its 150th birthday. You know, and they wanted lots of artists to chip in and celebrate being Canada. So he made all of these paintings. Many of them were paintings of grim-faced colonial Canadians signing away treaties that were getting rid of Indian land, for example. And you'll have a painting of a very serious set of men in black suits signing something, and in the corner there'll be a naked Indian figure, you know, dressed up in, as you see here, in often either naked or dressed queerly in heels and in this kind of queer form. So most of his native figures come in the form of very, very noticeable queerness, like significant forms of queerness. So what's happening in this painting? This painting appeared in a show that he called The Failure of Modernity. So there it is. I mean, you couldn't have a more clear sense of his intent, is to inscribe the failure of modernity and then to speak back using this visual language that is really speaking of wildness, disorder, disobedience, and riot. So what's happening in this painting? The painting is bristling with symbolic systems, many of which are at odds with each other. You have the backdrop of either blue skies or heaven. We're not sure, because the blue skies have within them both a helicopter and an angel, both of which are looking down on the scene below. If it's a helicopter, then, you know, this is a police helicopter calling the scene to order. If it's an angel, then we're asked to think about this as a different order of being. We see the familiar markers of urban riot, a burning car, for example, masculinized, racialized bodies in motion. You can see the figure holding a feather, and the feather often appears in his work as a symbol of the native. But there are also other indigenous figures, and then a figure in a basketball outfit suggesting multiple orders of racialization. There are also buffaloes in this area, but not just buffaloes, also a kind of Picasso-styled buffalo in quotation marks that are both the buffaloes in the back symbolize the loss of space, like where are they supposed to roam, right? Where the buffaloes roam, where is that? And then the other buffalo is sort of the figure of modernity that, of course, is being killed literally by the artist, who is also the matador, who is also holding a blanket. Now, that blanket is significant because it looks like a native blanket, but it's actually the Hudson Company trading blanket that was ripped off from native designs. So in the foreground of the painting, you see an astonishing scene of encounter. This, not the police and a mob, but the matador in drag and high heels confronting the bull of Western art itself. Okay. Other systems that are clashing, you've got the wires of communication up above, but also a totem pole that was supposed to signify a different relationship to the gods. Then in this area of the painting, you have what looks like a dead toreador. Well, that's exactly what it is. It is literally the dead toreador lifted directly out of a Manet painting from 1864, and then pushed plop down right in the middle of this native repainting of modern art. But what's amazing is that while in the original, the matador is not being tended to by anyone, in this native scene of encounter, a native woman is actually tending to the matador, implying a completely different understanding of care, violence, responsibility, neighborliness, ethics, and so on. Okay, so that's just some of what we see in a figure like this, in a painting by Kent Monkman. In the middle, the figure who brings some sort of order to the entire painting, or if you like, the axis around which the horizontality turns, is Kent Monkman's alter ego, who he calls Mischief Eagle Testicle. And he has painted many paintings with this figure. Here's another one. And this one is, I think, absolutely hilarious. At the other end of the painting, this is just a detail from a much larger painting. He's painting a cowboy who is strung up to a tree in the manner of Saint Sebastian. He's got lots of arrows sticking out of his body, and he has an erection. So this is a homoerotic scene of encounter, but it also reminds us that the relationship between the artist, the subject and the object, is both erotic but also violent. But then the hilarious piece is, of course, that here you have Kent Monkman, who's painted the entire thing as an indigenous artist, but the indigenous artist is depicted as somebody who can only draw a stick figure, right? So there's a sort of mise en abîme in this painting, as there are in so many. Most of his works incorporate Western art, only to refigure it, to recontextualize it, cut it up, take it out of context. It's like a William Burroughs cut up. He just grabs pieces, throws them in, and then makes them into something completely different. The paintings often are bewildering in their sheer size and in the relationship between figure and ground, the clash of classical, stereotyped and native imagery, the riot of bodies, and the relationships between authenticity and mimicry. The paintings, I would argue, seek to confuse, not to sort. You're not supposed to simply get it and move on to the next painting. They're not supposed to be alluring in a Mona Lisa type of way either. They are literally supposed to make you amazed. You are lost in the maze of the painting. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through the quotations from Fanny Howe, just to say Fanny Howe has a fantastic essay on bewilderment in which she lays out a sort of poetics of bewilderment. Okay, so let me conclude then. I think that Monkman's work offers us an aesthetic methodology of bewilderment. He easily masters the techniques that are recognizable as good in Western art, and then uses them in these incredibly theoretical ways. Remember, Jody Byrd referred to an indigenous critical theory. That's what this is. Indigenous critical theory, re-narrating the history of art and turning it into this scene of encounter. This image is from 2017. It's called Cain and Abel, and it features two nude but transmasculine bodies engaged in epic combat. Right, so it's Cain and Abel, but notice how we have multiple signifying systems of gender, right? They have male chests, the two figures, but they also have what could be interpreted as female genitalia. And those are not explained. The fact of this transmasculinity is nowhere explained in the painting. It is just sort of taken as part of the reinscription of bodies in the rethinking of the colonial encounter from the perspective of the two-spirited indigenous subject. The two figures in the foreground are engaged in epic combat as a female figure, reminiscent of John Gass' allegorical figure of American progress, half-heartedly strives to intercede. In the background, there are scenes of despair, rape, and plunder that reference and upend gender and racial conventions of conquest and white settlement. So let me conclude with this thought. The story of Cain and Abel represents in his hands much more. So he's not only rewriting Western art, he's also rewriting the biblical. The story of Cain and Abel is just represented as sort of sibling rivalry in the Bible. But in his hands, in Monkman's usage, the brothers represent not only the dynamics of a family drama, but differing relationships to the land. And of course, this is the principle of settler colonialism, is a relationship to the land. Abel, in the biblical myth, was a shepherd, while Cain was a farmer. In Monkman's hands, the brothers are locked in a mortal conflict that continues to haunt modernity, that of settlers versus nomads, owners versus temporary residents, people who stay put and seek to extract value from the land versus people who move around and see the land as a resource, not capital, right? So it is literally the encounter between the indigenous and the settler colonial. Abel, the nomadic sheep herder, falls at the hands of his brother and becomes the first martyr for wildness, the first victim, if you like, of civilization. The fact that the bodies of Cain and Abel in the painting are transgender or two-spirited, with male torsos and female genitalia, suggests a different relationship to the body, to gender, and to reproduction are also at stake here. As the bodies of cowboys are just sort of tossed aside by Indians in the backdrop, the painting reverses, if you like, the relationship between civilization and wildness, turning the former into a lost cause. So it's civilization that is brought down here, and the latter, or wildness, into the future whose time has come. So, and this is what I'll leave you with. Monkman's work here does nothing short of repainting the world, the wild, and everything in it. Thank you. All right, I'm not sure what our time constraints are here. It's been sort of a long evening already, but Jordan, do you have the theatre for a minute? For? I don't know how much time we have. Okay. Well, if someone kicks us out, we'll...
No.
So maybe we want to bring up the house lights at this point. There we go.
Hello. I've invited the disorder group to ask some questions. So before, does anybody else have any questions before we invite the disorder group? Gone. Disorder folks?
Hello, hi.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good, thanks. That was amazing. Thank you. I suppose I just wanted to hone in on something that occurred to me before we started talking about the paintings. And I was thinking about the way you spoke about the wild child.
Yeah, the wild child,
the wild animal, the wild native.
Yeah.
I was thinking about actually where the teenager might fit into this, because it strikes me that teenagehood is an interesting phase where we've learnt the rules of the civilized, but we may be thinking of, we may be rebelling, or we're perceived as rebelling, or we even should be rebelling. And I just wondered if the figure of the teenager was anywhere in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way in which we can prove that the child is a figure of wildness is that, and I've argued this in other places in the Queer Art of Failure, is that we spend so much damn time training the child. If and anyone who's been around a 2-year-old knows that they are wild, and it's very hard to control a kid. Once it can walk, you're in trouble, basically, because until they're subject to the kinds of methods we use to control everyone else, shame, punishment, threats, and so on, they are quite wild. And I think, we sort of invented adolescence in order to navigate that passage from wildness to adulthood, where you go from being the wild thing that must be controlled to being the agent of order who will control your child. And I'm not arguing for wild children, believe me, because, for anyone who's ever been on a train with one, they're not pleasant. But it does speak to a kind of wildness that is embedded in everyone's experience of being. So it's not something simply out there. It's something. It's sort of something we've all passed through. And the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, spent years studying really the subcultural manifestations of adolescence, precisely because there was a sense that these subcultural activities potentially contained within them the seeds of disruption, unruliness, and possibly revolt, right? So I think that we're still in that mode where we see, adolescence as the thing that must be most tightly controlled, because it's there that the fate of wildness rests. I mean, were you thinking something else there?
No, I just wanted to sort of hear a little bit more actually about the wild child in it. I did think about, I think you're sort of writing about the kind of disorderliness of overgrown adolescent males in kind of like bromance movies. Yeah, which I thought was interesting.
Well, right. So a lot of times, white dudes get to be wild and get to be bewildered and unknowing. That was, my argument about Dude, Where's My Car? And those kinds of bro films, Dumb and Dumber, Trump and Trumper, right? I mean, you can be stupid. As a white guy, you can be stupid and extremely powerful. In fact, those two things are not opposed the way they are for everybody else. So that's it's an interesting thing to notice about how we parse out identities and attributes. But the wild child has been the subject of all kinds of studies and films. There is this fantasy of the wild child who's raised by wolves. There's a Francois Truffaut film, The Wild Child, in which he had this kid come out of the woods, literally, and a school teacher takes him in, or a doctor, and tries to teach him language. So the wild child in that fantasy of otherness is the human who cannot be taught language. So this is one of the most significant dividing lines between the wild and the human is in fact language. And everyone from Heidegger to whoever have made a big deal about the fact that the animal doesn't speak and therefore is wild. So that's why the Eduardo Cohen book, How Forests Think, is so significant, because he's saying lots of things speak. Just because you're not speaking in language, or just because you're in the presence of things speaking that you don't understand, doesn't mean they're not speaking. So one of my colleagues at Columbia, what's her last name? She's a Latin American anthropologist, wrote about colonial Colombia, where colonialists went there and became really spooked when Colombians, they were forced to row the boats, and they made all kinds of noises that didn't sound like song to the colonial occupiers. And so it didn't sound like song. They cast it as noise and suggested that it was primitive babble, and it suggested to them why these people needed to be ruled. But so that's a colonial principle, that if you don't understand it, then there's something wrong with that kind of speech, when in fact this was song in a Colombian context, and in the song the Colombian people were signifying to each other what we need to do about these assholes who have come here to conquer us. I think it's similar in the forest, that Cohen writes about, that lots of creatures are telling each other, here comes someone, you should be a bit worried about, look out, you might want to jump on him, he's coming around the corner, whatever. So there's something so arrogant about believing that the human is the only thing with language.
Hi. Riffing off that for just a second, so it's the language sets up these hard dichotomies, and we understand the systems in those ways, but a teenager is like semi-civilized. A person who is mixed race kind of occupies both worlds or both spaces. People whose gender identities don't fall on one end of that spectrum or the other, like cis or trans, but somewhere in between. So I wonder if you can talk about pushing beyond those hard binaries in terms of language and understanding these kinds of systems, and third identities, semi-wild places, semi-civilized people.
Yeah, no, I'm not looking for semi-civilized people, and I'm not looking for any people. I'm looking at signifying systems, I think, which is why I went to the Monkman at the end as opposed to, say, a group, you know, because the problem with the way that wildness has been assigned is that it's part of a system of racialization. So on the topic of adolescence, you'll remember that the horrendous Central Park case in which 5 black male adolescents were accused of raping a Central Park jogger back in the 90s. They were accused of wilding, of running wild, and suddenly this term was a thing in the US. It was like no one had really used this term before, and people, white people reading the paper were confronted with this possibility that groups of teenage men of color were running rampage through cities wilding. Now, you know, it was just really interesting that that language was used. And there's a documentary now showing how the 5 adolescents were framed and, in fact, jailed for this crime that they did not commit, and that eventually new DNA evidence proved. And yet there's never a kind of a, you know, it's never like the system then like completely collapses when you realize these kinds of absolute injustices are a part of the daily life of the court system in the US. It's not like it implodes at all. It's just like, oh, I guess we have to be more careful about that. So that category of wilding would never be used, for example, for a group of white guys who were on a bit of a bender and, you know, did something or were accused of something. They would be seen as, you know, organized people who just went off their rockers a little bit, something like that. So this idea of wilding.
Naive, the escaping of responsibility.
Naive, they peer pressure, they were subject to peer pressure, you know. So we find rational explanations in the face of the potential idea that black men had raped a white jogger in Central Park. That was the language immediately, wilding. So it's never, you know, in relationship to race, it's never far from people's consciousness about the problem with race. So I'm not interested in then you know producing examples of people who are semi-civilized or semi-wild. I'm interested in thinking about that logic and then thinking about some of the aesthetic work that might short-circuit it on behalf of a reinvented understanding of the wild that comes apart from the definitions assigned to it under colonialism. I think you had another one over here as well, so yeah.
I'll try to. Oh, who's got a question?
Hello. So I was literally just yesterday reading this Bell Hooks essay on Columbus, which is called Columbus, Dead But Not Forgotten, I think, or something like this. And she's talking about this in relation to education systems and how, like, this is a brilliant moment where she says about how, like, because colonial history is taught in US history lessons as this kind of like quasi-celebratory kind of like tone to it, that the notion of colonialism is taught as this inherently kind of normal human trait,
right.
And like the assignation of human is like very racial there as well, but like rather than something which is very culturally specific. And she, like, the entire essay is this kind of call to an ethics of like love as a revolutionary practice and as a way of being in the world. So, but which seems like it's like it has a real like potency as this kind of like counter to like the frenzy of capitalism. But at the same time, like it makes me wonder about like whether or not it's possible from the position of like people who've already gone through the education system or like still being in a world that has this like frenzy of capitalism, whether or not it's possible to counter that with something which is like a calmness and has this kind of like ethical like generosity to it, or whether or not it needs to have this kind of like the stance of kind of like anarchy and like wilderness often is like assigned like the idea of rage a lot, which obviously is like problematic in a way of like this kind of like sense of like irrationalness versus untrammeled rage or whatever. But whether or not it's possible to counter like the frenzy of capitalism with something which is like as generous as like an ethical like call to love, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just heard a great talk by Nick Murtzoff actually recently on decolonial love, which I am not going to be able to reproduce here, but he's somebody who was very involved in the Occupy movement and is very involved in the take all the monuments down, all the monuments that litter American landscapes and that are homages to Southern generals, you know, and to the memory of slavery. So I think, love isn't the category I would use, but I have seen it used in interesting ways. I think the reason I'm going to wildness is because it holds within it already all of these categories that have been discarded, including queerness, including the indigenous, including the animal, and including the immature or premature. So I think as we're becoming disenchanted with the politics of identity, we have to look for these other sorting mechanisms that might produce some kind of solidarity between groups who, under the regime of identity, just understand themselves as sort of separate, separately opposing something, but never in solidarity. And I think Nick was arguing something about a decolonial politics of love. Thank you.